Okay, welcome to Current Issues Part 2. Let's get started. Now we're going to move on to another international organization, and that's known as the United Nations. You should remember the United Nations was formed after World War II. It's kind of similar in mission to the League of Nations, but the United Nations was designed to eliminate some of the problems and issues that the League of Nations had, but it's by no means perfect. One of the issues around that the UN has had a lot of criticism for is the fact that the United Nations was formed to stop war and to prevent war and specifically to prevent genocide. And it generally has not been too successful with that. There's been many genocides that have occurred, and the UN has had limited effectiveness in ending them or helping to even slow them down. Again, genocide, just to remind you, the definition of genocide is the attempt to exterminate. So that means to end a particular target group of people, and specifically that there is government involvement in this effort. Ethnic cleansing, this is a term that's also thrown around. Again, murder or forced migration, so forcing people to move from an area where they live and try to make them exit your country, again, is another, is usually tied into this idea of genocide. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948, again, in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust. This was the standard that all of the nations of the world were supposed to abide by, even though it was a non-binding resolution. So it's not like a country will be, on like we're not going to be able to enforce it in any way if we find that a country violates it. But the idea was that all countries of the world are supposed to abide by a certain standard, that people shouldn't worry about dying, that people shouldn't be arrested for no reason or something like that. These were part of this Declaration of Human Rights, this kind of very basic standard. But what we've seen is that there's a lot of countries who violate this. All right, finally is a group known as Amnesty International. They sometimes show up on the Regents. Amnesty International is an example of an NGO, so that means it's a non-governmental organization. Amnesty International is a private group, and they basically keep track of human rights. And if a country is violating human rights, if they are violating this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Amnesty International investigates those claims and exposes them to the world in order to put pressure on the countries to stop this behavior and change. All right, again, these are some examples of genocide that you should have studied this year. The first recognized genocide is the Armenian genocide. From 33 to 45 is the European genocide, otherwise known as the Holocaust. Holocaust is a better name for that. Really, it's this is the one that was specifically targeted the Jews of Europe, but other groups as well, communists, homosexuals, the disabled, so on and so forth. 1974, Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, the Bosnian genocide that took place in the former Yugoslavia after the fall of the USSR, the Rwandan genocide where the Hutus were killing the Tutsis in Africa, and the Darfur genocide, another African genocide. And just to be clear, this is not the final number. As of 2018, there are charges of genocide and ethnic cleansing against, just off the top of my head, there's one going on with the Rohingya in Burma, and there's another one in the Congo going on between different tribal groups there. So it's unfortunately something that continues to present day. All right, next global issue we're going to take a look at is diseases. HIV/AIDS is a big one in the modern day. In ninth grade, you sort of studied the Black Death, but what we're talking about here is with the increase in travel, with new technologies that allow people to travel all over the world, what we're seeing is that diseases don't just stay in one geographic area, that they have a tendency to make their way around the world. So that's a big concern. One that did exactly that with deadly consequences, HIV/AIDS. And this is a disease that started in Africa, but quickly spread all over the world, and has killed millions and millions of people. Today, there are drugs that can manage the disease, but it's still an issue. One of the issues surrounding HIV/AIDS is the fact that it's identified as a gay disease or a disease for intravenous drug users, and different populations that are where there's a lot of prejudice against them. So that kind of impacts, the ability of these people to gain health care and to seek out treatment when they have symptoms. Anyway, HIV/AIDS is an issue all over the globe, but really where it's having the biggest impact is in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, sub meaning below the Sahara Desert. So this is more that southern area within Africa. And what happens is a lot of the countries in that area are very poor. So naturally, it impacts their ability to access health care. So that's why 71% of people in that area of the world have AIDS or HIV. I think these numbers were accurate as of 2012, so they may have changed since, but I doubt by very much. So it still gives you at least a ballpark idea. But as of 2012, there were 1 in 20 adults living with HIV in that area. And again, it affects economic development. You have a large number of families where, the parents are very sick or they pass on. And you have situations where you have little kids, 12 years old, who are raising all of their brothers and sisters, where they can't go to school, where they just have no money. And again, as a nation, instead of putting money towards economic development or other programs, you're having to put more and more of those resources towards managing this healthcare crisis. And of course, HIV/AIDS isn't the only one. I mean, recently, as of 2018, one of the big ones recently was the Zika, and as well as Ebola, which again, there was fears that those could become pandemics as well and spread all over. Thankfully, they've both been managed. But it's a big concern. Everybody's worried about the next huge healthcare crisis that could go global. Okay, another global issue is nuclear proliferation. As you should be aware, if any nation uses a significant number of nuclear weapons, it's going to affect the world. These are weapons that have they release so much radiation into the atmosphere. Again, it will have global ramifications. After World War II, the U.S. was the first to develop nuclear technology, but we were followed very rapidly by the USSR. Israel is another country that has nuclear weapons, and the issue was, okay, well, Israel was the only country in the Middle East that had nuclear weapons, and there was a certain belief that, because they were the only nuclear power in the Middle East, that might keep them safe. Of course, now one of the issues that's come up is with Iran. Iran had a program to develop nuclear weapons, but under President Obama, there was an agreement we reached with Iran to prevent the country from developing nuclear bombs. There was some debate. Some people were for that agreement, some people were against it, but the idea behind the agreement was that it would prevent Iran from building up a nuclear weapon in exchange for economic benefits. What has happened since is President Trump has decided to withdraw from that agreement, and Iran, as of 2018, has committed to restarting its nuclear program and developing a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. So stay tuned in the news for that happy development. Beyond that, we also have the issue of Pakistan and India. As you should remember from the slide presentation on Indian independence, India and Pakistan, basically they can't stand each other. And both countries have a nuclear arsenal. So there's a great deal of fear that the part of the world where we're most likely to see World War III would be within India and Pakistan, who right now, both of them are kind of, there's disagreements over the area of Kashmir that they both lay claim to. There are issues with Pakistan. It's an Islamic nation. Terrorists from Pakistan are going over the border and attacking India, targets in India. So there's a great deal of concern that that's where, that these two countries may get to the point where if they go to war, it could become nuclear. And finally, North Korea is now the newest country to develop a nuclear arsenal. As of today, recently, the head of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, has met with the leaders in South Korea, and supposedly, Kim Jong-un has been saying that he's interested in stopping his nuclear development program in exchange for more economic programs, economic benefits that might come from that. So again, it's North Korea's development of nuclear weapons has given it a very powerful card to play, with regard to the rest of the world. They certainly can't be ignored. So we'll see how that develops. One of the other issues about nuclear weapons too, or at least nuclear power, is it's not just used for weapons. It's also a very important power source, and some countries are more dependent on it than others. People who are fans of nuclear power point to the fact that when done right, nuclear power produces a lot of energy at a very low cost, and it's very clean. Unlike fossil fuels, it doesn't produce, it doesn't have the same carbon impact. Of course, people who are against nuclear power say, well, yeah, but when you're producing nuclear power, there's some, like the coolants and things like that. You're still producing, there's still radiation concerns with the production of it. But really the biggest issue that people point at is when nuclear power, when there's a problem, there's a big problem. One of the big example of this is Chernobyl. Chernobyl is in Russia, and this power plant, nuclear power plant in Chernobyl went into meltdown. And as a result, many people died. The entire town, this huge area around the nuclear power plant, had to be evacuated. And now, it's decades later, that land still cannot be lived on because of the radiation that was released from the meltdown. So another one is in Japan. That's the most recent one. The Fukushima accident. It was a nuclear power plant that there had been a tsunami that affected Japan. And this natural disaster ended up damaging the nuclear power plant. And again, releasing a lot of radiation into the area. And right now, Japan is struggling to manage that cleanup. There's a lot of people around the power plant who have been exposed to high-level radiation. And of course, this naturally is going to lead to higher rates of cancer and things like that. So it's something that as the world we have concerns about. Final point I'm going to talk about is the war against terrorism. You should, as Americans, be aware of 9/11 and the horrors of that. I'm not going to go into detail on it. But suffice to say, in the wake of 9/11, the United States went to war both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on it, but suffice to say, one of the issues that came up in both of these were these engagements ended up lasting for a really, really long time, and they ended up having a lot of unintended consequences. For example, in Iraq, we removed Saddam Hussein from power, and it's hard to argue that you can't argue that Saddam Hussein was a nice guy. I mean, he was a really brutal totalitarian leader, but by removing him from power, it ended up kind of throwing off the balance of power in that region of the world, and kind of opened Iraq up to getting attacked by ISIS and other forces. So again, a lot of negative unintended consequences of removing Saddam Hussein from power. Another issue was in Afghanistan. We went to war in Afghanistan, again, in the wake of 9/11, in an effort to get rid of the Taliban, who supported terrorism, who allowed the attackers of 9/11. They got a lot of their training in Afghanistan. And sure, we were able to remove the Taliban from power, but as of today, in 2018, we still have soldiers in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is not over. It is now the longest war in U.S. history, and it's still not ended. So that's a concern. This is billions of dollars. Wars are expensive, and it really kind of hurts our economy, because the more money we spend on wars, the less money we have to spend on domestic programs. Another issue surrounding this kind of fight on terrorism is the issue with civil liberties. And something that should be considered for global, but definitely something that you're going to explore in U.S. history, is this trade-off between security and safety versus freedom and personal liberties. And what happens is for example, in the wake of 9/11, the NSA was able to have greater access to people's information, your cell phone calls and your internet searches and things like that. And the idea is by giving the government more access to that information, it's going to give them a better ability to identify terrorists, prevent terrorist attacks and things like that, and make us safer. By the same token, it's also taking away a lot of people's freedom, and there's some concerns about civil liberties and that being a violation there. So that kind of back and forth. Another issue that's coming up with the fight on terrorism is this use of drones. You should be familiar with drones. I mean, they have drones you can buy from, Toys R Us or whatever. Oh, well, forget it. There's no more Toys R Us anymore, but you can pick it up in Target, let's say. But this idea that attacking terrorists, I mean, the nature of war has really changed since World War II. I mean, in World War II, say what you will about Nazis, very bad guys, but, at least when you were attacking Nazis, I mean, they were wearing SWAT stickers on their uniforms. It's very easy to pick them out in a crowd. All right, that's the bad guy, kill him. Nowadays, when it comes to the war on terrorism, it's not so simple. The bad guys aren't necessarily labeled. And terrorists have no qualms about hiding amongst civilian targets, even things like churches and schools, And so when we try as a nation to target terrorists, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to take out civilians. And again, this has been an issue since World War II when we launched bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And again, the danger of going after civilian targets. And with drones, I mean, these are unpiloted, unmanned aircraft that are able to drop bombs, and there's been some issues about whether or not they've taken out civilians along with possible terrorist targets, and how accurate is the information used on them, and how easy are they to use. So there's some concerns about that. And then Abu Ghraib and the U.S. torture report. Kind of horrific stuff that the United States did. The United States, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. When it comes to ISIS, I mean, they're just evil. There's plenty of video which do not go searching for it, but, there's things where these guys will take people and just, make them bend over and cut their heads off on video. And there's no doubt that these are evil, bad people who are capable of terrible, terrible action. So to kind of turn around and say, yeah, they're evil and, we should be nice to them, that doesn't feel good. Naturally, if somebody cuts the head off of an American citizen, yeah, it would feel good to make the guy miserable and pull their fingernails out and, torture the people. I mean, they certainly deserve it for the evil stuff they do. I get that. But one of the issues, and I'll kind of paraphrase John McCain, who's a U.S. Senator from Arizona, who himself was a victim. He was a prisoner of war, and he was a victim of terror, of torture. He said, shouldn't America hold itself to a higher standard? Shouldn't we be better than that? And that's the trade-off. I mean, some people argue, hey, you have to be willing to use terrorism because, if there's an attack, we need to stop that attack. We've got to be willing to do what we have to do to get the information. But then others, especially experts in the field, argue, hey, if you torture somebody, he'll tell you whatever the hell you want to hear. That doesn't mean it's the truth. A lot of the information you get under torture isn't true. It's not accurate. It's just, you cause me enough pain, I'll tell you whatever. I'll tell you the moon is made of green cheese. So that's an issue. And then there's also the issue, again, of hurting the U.S. standard in the world, that, if we're looked at as this country that's worthy of respect and people see us as a place of freedom and things like that, when we get accused and are found guilty of using torture, what does that do to what people in the world think of us. And should we care? And does that hurt us in our ability to build coalitions and to work with other nations to fight terrorism? So anyway, again, this isn't directed to try to make you say that there's one right answer. That's not my goal here. My goal is just to make you aware that these are issues that the world, and naturally the United States being part of that world, that we're kind of currently grappling with. And they're not easy answers. There's no easy answers. These are really tough questions that we're all dealing with. So with that, I'm going to end the presentation. And if you've had a chance to see my other videos, really best of luck passing the global regents. Hope these are helpful. All right, bye-bye.